Good morning, friends, colleagues. My name is Bashir Fancy. I am one of the founders at BTPAC, or BIZTEK Professionals Association of Canada, part of ICCP. So you can look it up, iccp.org. I'm here today as part of the series that we've been doing to talk about high velocity IT, but actually we're going to convert it into a fireside chat with a prominent, not only speaker, but a very knowledgeable IT person who's written a book on IT, ITEL 4, is authored with his team. He's a frequent speaker around the world on this, and his views are very much in line with what we're talking about, which is where the future is going, bringing business and IT together. And this discussion will revolve around me asking some questions, and he's a fabulous guy. So let me tell you a little more about him so that we can talk about that. So, as I said, it's BIZTEK Professionals Association of Canada. The four founders whose email names are here, and it's part of ICCP, as I just said. Now, our speaker, Mark Smalley, he's a big guru on paradigm shift, and he is actually going to be on shortly from Amsterdam. So as we promised, we're going to get the best of the best from around the world. That is, in fact, what we're doing. So let me tell you a little bit about Mark Smalley so that you get a pretty good idea about what he's all about. So Mark Smalley is a pretty insightful, dynamic, enjoyable speaker. In having known him somewhat, and he's done presentation for us before, he's actually a master in describing the relationship between business and IT. Mark also understands how to integrate development, operational IT frameworks, and he's an ISL, BISL expert. His observation on IT, the culture, are really refreshing. He, as I mentioned, is very knowledgeable, has experience, creativity, and vision, a pretty powerful combination. All this, including his background in writing the ITEL 4 book that they have published, and he led the thing with his team, is very important, and now it's going to take on a new meaning because, as I said, he has been a consultant, he's done all sorts of things, was a hands-on guy, still is in a different way in that he now can speak to where things are going. So what Mark is going to talk about today is going to become particularly very important because of what the world we're going to be facing very shortly with COVID-19 or post-COVID-19 era. So I don't want to take any more time because we're very fortunate to actually have a very important personality from Europe, from Amsterdam to be precise, Mark Smalley. What we're going to do is actually have a conversation with Mark, who's got, as I said, tremendous knowledge and experience, and that would be very helpful to all our members. So how about we bring Mark? I possibly have left some things out, so you can certainly fill them in, and then
Sure.
So go ahead. You can give a little bit of your background. What would be helpful?
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to say, if technology permits, I'd like to invite anybody who's listening who wants to participate. I expect you've got a chat channel in the technology. If somebody can place a question, happy to turn this into something interactive.
Yes.
We must have met 5 or 6 years ago in person. We did some online stuff after that, which was fun. At the time, I was involved with a foundation in the Netherlands called the ASL-BSL Foundation, where we'd in particular been focusing on the relationship between business people and IT, and trying to help business people with that that struggle that has always been around, and I think still is in some cases. How do you deal with those difficult IT people? So we were trying to give business people guidance how to help them with that, and the foundation still exists, except that we parted company a couple of years ago, I think now, and it was interesting. I not only terminated that contract, but I thought I'd take the advantage of dropping a couple of things, creating a vacuum, just seeing what would happen. Because as we all know, nature abhors a vacuum, so you create a vacuum, something happens. And pretty quickly, the people at Axelos, who are the publishers of ITIL, they contacted me. They in fact, they've just rounded it off, really. They've done a major renovation of the ITIL body of knowledge, which has been around for ages, for decades, giving guidance to the IT service management industry. The new update is called ITIL 4. And although I'm a bit of a stranger, well, possibly because I'm a bit of an outsider to the IT service management area, they asked me to write their strangest book, which is called High Velocity IT. And if you see that pink, I just think I'm pointing it to it, that pink book.
Yes.
There, that's the publication. That was a very interesting process. The brief was to think about people in the more traditional kind of organization in service management, which is often very much organized in specialities, in silos. That's a traditional way of organizing IT service management, and but that doesn't really work anymore in the more digitally enabled organizations where business and IT are converging into one. So the brief to me was to write a book which reflects the more digitally enabled organization and the ways of thinking, ways of working that people apply there. It was very much an emergent process. I contacted, I think, almost 50 people in total across 18 countries. Pretty pleased to get a diverse opinions on what should be in the book. I co-authored the book with 22 other contributors, and it's quite exciting because although the Axelos, the people who asked me to write the book, they really wanted to know up front what's going to be in the book, but I'd taken an emergent way of working, so I said I'll tell you when we've done. So it really, things emerged, and I made sure that it became something fairly coherent. The book's called, and I think in our discussion, I think that we could touch on a couple of topics that might be of interest. One is the topic of ethics, which is very close to my heart, and particularly in times where technology has an unprecedented impact on the economy and on society. I think we could explore that topic. Another thing I was thinking about, and I think we can see this very clearly with the corona stuff going on, we are living in very unpredictable times. And the topic of dealing with complex systems, complex adaptive systems, where you simply can't predict what's going to happen. Behavior just emerges and you have to deal with it on the spot. That demands a different way of working. I did of course, all physical conferences have stopped now, but one of the last physical conferences I did in Russia, in Moscow, and it was called How to Escape from Project Plan Prison. And the idea behind it was that project plans are often based on the idea that you can predict the future. So you say, we want these deliverables, these are the milestones, you've got to reach those. And it's very much a confirmatory approach where you execute the plan and you confirm, you tick on the box, we've achieved this, achieved this, achieved this. But if you just take the current situation, we don't know. We don't know. So what you're seeing is lots of people, and I believe this is the right way to do it. And I think that I can confirm this with the theory behind complexity thinking. The best approach is to do parallel experiments. So because nobody knows how to do it, you get people working in independent groups, not talking to each other, not influencing other, but doing their own thing. And of the 5 or 6 experiments that you do in parallel, maybe 1 or 2 will work, the others won't. But that's usually the most effective way in a complex. So, but that does mean you have to escape from that project plan prison. So that could be a topic we could explore.
Yes, absolutely.
And another thing that has fascinated me for years is how IT people explain the value of their work to business executives who don't want to be bored with the details. So I think we've certainly got three topics we could explore.
So this is actually very interesting, Mark. Everything you just said is near and dear to my heart. It's something that I've been pushing because you're right. I don't think the business is going back to pre-corona days. It's not happening. I mean, 2.7 billion people around the world have been laid off. It has 81% of the workforce. Even as they come back, it's not going to be the same. People are working from home and all that. So let's pick up the first part you talked about, which is very interesting, that we know that technology has been changing rapidly. Innovation was happening before all this problem happened. This has now been complicated by exactly what you just said. The complicated systems and how we go about it, especially people are working from home. And I don't see, some parts will change. But why don't we pick up the first part where now that we are dealing with this complex systems, I mean, I don't know if any technology, the telecommunication firm have predicted that everybody would be working from home for 3-4 months, right? It was just not one of the things they ever thought about.
No.
Yet they have to deal with network and make sure it's up there in most part. Yeah. So use some of that thing and see if we can explore, like what you talked about, working in parallel on 3-4 different things.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
sure. If we take that complexity thing first, and I think in fact it's quite you make a good point. It's quite a miracle that the networks are still standing, aren't they? They must be. Mind you, it might be the case that because businesses have closed down, it's freed up some capacity which is now being used at home.
Right.
But people can't predict this, so they have to improvise. Just taking a couple of steps back. And thinking out loud, while we're speaking, I'll make some notes to send you some material that people could take a look at afterwards to dive into maybe some of the topics we're dealing with in a bit more detail. And I'm happy to open up the channel to me. If anybody wants to get in touch, follow up on stuff, please do. It's always a delight to be of service.
That's fantastic.
Absolutely. To good people. That's good.
Yeah.
Just a little bit of theory, which I ran into 6 or 7 years ago now, and seriously, I've been in this business for quite a while now. Is the thing that changed my thinking in the most fundamental way. I've just thinking about my career. It's quite strange. I only realized recently that I am now experiencing my 6th decade of professional IT, because I started off at the end of the 70s. You got the 70s, 80s, 90s. So we're now in the 20s. So ridiculous. It's quite strange, isn't it? And the interesting thing of having that perspective is that I've saw the emergence of the project management movement, where we wanted to build systems. We wanted to get that development process under control. So we had project management came up first. That was the 70s, 80s. Then in the 90s, people started to look around and discover, gosh, we've built an awful lot of systems. We need to start managing them better. So you saw the emergence of the IT management, IT service management industry after project management, or in parallel with. Then in the 2000s, people were complaining about IT being too slow. You saw the emergence of the agile movement. You see the pendulum swinging back and forth. And in the past decade, I think it's a toss-up between the DevOps movement, which is quite interesting, and digital transformation, which is a term that's used and abused, I think, and even is becoming quite a toxic term, because vendors are abusing the term for all purposes. Anyway, that perspective. But what I ran into about 6 or 7 years ago was this complexity thinking. There's a guy in Denmark who presented it to me, And the framework which really caught my eye is called the Cynefin framework. And that's Cynefin, Cynefin. And I'll send you a link to some thoughts on that. And it gives you it's a sense-making framework. I quite like that idea. It tries to help you make sense of the world that you're working in. It's based on the assumption, there's a bit of theory here, but I hope it gives us some building blocks to play around with that people recognize. It suggests that there are three basic kinds of systems. One is ordered, where you can predict what's happening. The second one is complex, where behavior is emergent. And the third form is chaotic behavior, where things just explode and it's extremely urgent. And then the theory behind this framework says you can split ordered up into two parts. One is called clear, where it's obvious to any reasonably thinking person how to act. You know, if you're very predictable, if I was to let this mug drop, you know it would go down and break and all the water would fall out of it. That's obvious. It's like baking a cake from a recipe. If you follow the recipe, you get a cake. Now that the second half of ordered is complicated. So you've got clear and complicated. With complicated, you know that you can work it out in the end, but it's going to take some time. Sending a rocket to the moon, for instance, is an example of a complicated environment where you have to do lots of analysis, but the information is knowable. If you do it, you'll get to the moon. And in fact, you might get to the moon with more predictability than baking a cake in some cases. But that's the simple part. That's the ordered part of the universe. When you move into complex, a nice analogy is bringing up a child. You don't have a plan. Anybody who has children, you know, you probably do have plans, or you had illusions. But you can't plan these things. Things just happen. And that's an example of a complex environment where behavior just emerges and where you have to try different tactics and just see what's going to happen with this particular child. You know, what happened with one child won't work for another child. So you see this playing around with different options. And when you're in that complex area and experimenting, you could say that your information horizon is much shorter. You can't, there are things that are simply not knowable. It's a bit like that old Don Rumsfeld thing, you know, the known unknowns and stuff like that, just to bring up, you know, come back, W, all is forgiven. All
that's right. That's unknown unknowns.
Yeah, unknown unknowns. But it's interesting for me. I was a hardcore developer guy. I tended to think in if then else. It was either this or it's that, 0 or it's 1. There's no grey area in between. But what this does, painfully, it confronts you with the fact that the real life is if then maybe. You know, you don't know. So but it's a recognition that some things are knowable. Some things are known. Some things are knowable, like how to get to the moon. That is knowable. You can apply science and discover it. Some things are simply unknowable. So it's futile to make plans. And that's where that escape from Project Plan prison came into. You know, you've got to recognize if you've made sense of your universe and you've decided this is complex and therefore unknowable, you have to act differently. Finally, when things are chaotic, which is another next domain, then you just simply have to act immediately. And you could say the corona crisis first was in the chaotic domain, in the sense that leaders around the world had to act decisively to at least I think they had two problems. Well, their major problem is how to strike a balance between personal safety of people, personal freedom of people, and the economy. Sort of an iron track. People, you know, you look at your various governments. They're playing with which is the least important at the moment. Playing around with those things. So restricting people's freedom, so that more people survive. So that's one of the things you play with. But with the government, I think you've seen governments trying to reassure people who are panicking too much, panicking unnecessarily. So that's one of the roles of leadership. And the other role of leadership is people who are too complacent to make them realize that this is serious. So, got to take action. Once in the chaotic domain, once you stabilized it, you can bring it back up into the complex domain and start. What you're seeing around the world is people are experimenting with different ways of flattening the curve. You can see the cultural differences. What works in China, for instance, where the culture there, people respond to a pretty strict regime. So, lockdown completely. Those are the rules. They can that society can deal with that kind of approach, and it worked for them. It wouldn't work in the Netherlands, here where I live, because people don't have that high regard for the government. They want more personal freedom. So you're seeing all these parallel experiments at the same time. People trying to work out what's the best way of action. So it's just a little bit. So I'll stop now so we can reflect on that. Is the underlying theory that you make the distinction between domains in which knowledge is available, is known, domains where it's knowable, and therefore you can apply analysis to discover the right answer, and where it's complex, where things emerge. And just a final comment that if, for instance, if you've spent a lot of time in the IT service management area where process is a very strong, or if you worked in a bureaucratic area, you rely very much on process, you'll be biased to think whatever situation occurs, we need more process. If you're a business analyst, for instance, your gut feeling will be to say we need more time to discover more, to do more analysis, to discover more information. But it might be the case that information simply isn't available. And that's where you have to move into the politicians and battlefield commanders who bring everybody in, they let them experiment all over the place and see what works. And that's usually a decent approach. So different horses for courses.
I think, Mark, you've touched some very important areas, because one of the things I have been talking about lately, which you have actually said, I used different term. I said, we keep talking about legacy systems, and my view is we're suffering from legacy thinking, right? Mm-hmm. Which is interesting. So yeah, you got a legacy problem, but you can't keep talking about it for 30 years and keep doing the same thing. The second thing which you touched, which is very interesting, is that if you went into a corporate world, and I don't mean in a harsh way to anybody, but this is the reality, is that if you go into companies, they are told what their problem is and what their solution is by the vendor, right? They don't know their own needs. And I learned the first thing is that you better find out what your needs are before you go out looking for it. Because if you have the same vendor telling you what the problem is, then you're asking for trouble. Because they'll say, oh, you got this hardware, that hardware, so the next progression for you is this. As opposed to, let's take a step back. What is that you really need? What are your problems? And I compare it to one thing in internal audit that I did. When I headed that globally, and turn around and say, by the way, you sit down with the CEO or any of the other guys and you talk to two people. What is keeping you awake at night? What are you worried about, right? And right now, every CEO is probably thinking, how am I going to survive this organization? Because we know that a lot of companies are going to go belly up. Doesn't matter, government can keep funding up to a certain point. But then what? I mean, 96% of the aircraft are parked around the world. The cargo ones are flying. Just because they start flying the service again doesn't mean everybody's going to fly tomorrow. No. Yeah. Because like you said, depending on who takes what action in the government to flatten the curve, whatever, some may have recurrence, as we have seen in South Korea. And so that brings it. So the question back on technology is that because of the fact that they outsource, right, to different countries, they didn't have the skill sets. We also played around with wordings like cloud computing, and I go, what is cloud computing? You mean you outsource it to somebody? There is no cloud. You outsource it, but we don't like that term, so we call it cloud, right?
Yeah.
So now every Tom, Dick, and Harry is thinking, oh, why they use an iPhone or whatever, that my data is in the cloud. No, it is not in the cloud. It's on somebody's computer somewhere in the world. And if you don't take care of it, nobody else is. Because remember, we didn't outsource because those guys were fantastic in security or whatever. You outsource because of the cost, because it's cheaper, right? So now we have to deal with all that, plus the fact that we've seen with the borders kind of closed in a technology sense. If you outsource, one of the potential things that could be happening is people may want to bring the outsourcing they may have done in critical areas back. Or maybe you might turn and say, okay, if it's Netherlands, we'll process. Have outsourcing company in Netherlands, so you can outsource to this guy so we can have better control. Same thing in Canada, so that you don't have that problem. Question is, do you have the skill sets in the company to do that when you outsourced it, right?
Yeah. No, that problem's been around for quite a while. When you outsource the work, you also outsource the knowledge, so you're unable to take it back. What I've seen in the DevOps industry, which is quite an interesting area,
right,
is that people are focusing on doing more work themselves and outsourcing less work. And they've done some research as well, which identified that if you're talking about outsourcing, it's best to outsource a whole value stream rather than just outsource a function in the stream. For instance, the testing function or the development function. That seems to be less effective. So either you do all of it, or you. But you're seeing people being pretty selective in what they outsource, particularly if it concerns information systems that are really important part of the strategy. If you're talking about digital products and services that an organization provides, people are often doing it themselves now. And you're seeing what we're also seeing in that area. You see it in the agile and the DevOps communities. The focus on product-based teams rather than, and I'll rephrase it, more permanent product-based teams rather than temporary project-based teams. And that's a fundamental difference, that with projects, you bring people to the work and you get the work done, and the people that disappear. The other way around, if you've got a product-based team, you're taking work to the people to be done. Different way of, and it's got some challenges as well, because if you've got a fairly permanent team with fixed capacity, it's difficult to scale up and down. But it does seem to be a tendency for people to organize to not outsource it and organize it themselves in more product-based teams. Couple of comments before I forget,
right. Yeah.
Then I'll send you a link.
Yeah.
You mentioned the cloud business, outsourcing to the cloud. You could say the cloud comes into the utility kind of area of technology. We've got it down to a fine art, and we've industrialized it. There's a guy called Simon Wardley who's come up with a concept of Wardley mapping. That's Wardley, Simon Wardley. If you look for Wardley mapping, you'll find it easily enough. And he's got a neat way of helping you to think about, if you look at the various components in your organization, including the IT components, which parts are industrialized and could you outsource, and which parts are so critical to your business that you should be making tailor-made solutions because they're so essential to your core. So that Wardley mapping that's something that's worth taking a look at. That was one. Another, just before that came up, before you talked about the cloud, you mentioned business people having to know what kind of questions to ask. It reminded, and people blindly following what vendors say. it reminded me something about what Taiichi Ono said. Taiichi Ono, some people will know him as the father of the Toyota production system, which was the precursor of the lean movement. Legendary guy in the lean world, Taiichi Ono. And he came up with a great saying. He said, you have to face your own difficulties and think for yourself. Stop trying to borrow wisdom. Which is something you often, you go to conferences, you hear people talking about how they solved a particular problem with this approach, and what often comes into play is because they have a success story. They've got survivor bias as well. So they're telling it from the perspective of the survivor. People who did exactly the same thing and failed, they're not telling the story. So but you got somebody at a conference telling how they think that things happened in their organization, even if it was true, which it often isn't, because they tell their stories differently because they think they were the major factor in success. You would be foolish to think that their solution in their circumstances would work in your particular, in your organization with its own specific characteristics, which is what Taiichi Ono means with stop trying to borrow wisdom. You've really got to think about these things. You've got to what's your problem? What's keeping you awake at night?
Right.
You've got to think about, formulate that.
So that is actually a very powerful thing you just talked about. So it brings a couple of things to mind. And I want to take what your view on that is. Number one is that we've had some people work at the same thing for a very long time. And like you talked about yourself, and even again, that would be true of me too. We've done different things. We did this and we realized, okay, I want to learn more, and you start to do. When there have been people who tell me that they've done something for 30, 40 years, many times I turn and say, no, you haven't done it for 30, 40 years. You've done it for 1 year. It's not 40 years. Yeah, it's 1 year experience repeating 39 times.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it 40-year experience. And we see a lot of that. The reason I bring that statement up now, it's vital, is that in technology, as we are seeing it a lot more, and I found the equivalent of that in audit as well, is that when we send people who have been auditing banks and other companies for too long, same guys, they get very familiar with the auditor-auditee relationship. You see that out all the time. What then happens is they go in there and say, well, you've seen this thing before. It's not a problem. And they do a cursory look. You send a new guy who doesn't know anything about it. And I used to get thrown into those situations quite a bit. And that's what made me, is I don't know anything about this. I would go with a blank piece of paper. You start to ask questions. And you find out things that the other guys did not, because they made assumptions, right?
Yeah.
Whereas then, so what happens here, that's part one. Part two, you mentioned about the fact that just because you worked in another company may not work for you. And I think that's very true. And we are calling it conduct risk, right? It's culture of the organization. It's going to play a very big role in it. I mean, there's no point putting all the young guys who are dynamic and have the guy on top who still thinks the way he did 40 years ago, right? But the world has changed. And so I think the question is, are you dynamically looking at the real problems and your needs, and then you come up with a solution? So what do you think of this culture and the part that the familiarity?
No, that's right. No, we can explore that, certainly. Just another example of the legendary Taiichi Ono. He was in charge of how managers did their stuff at Toyota. So when a new manager came along, there's a story that he would draw a circle on the floor, on the factory floor. He'd put the manager in that little chalk circle, and he'd say, "Watch what happens." And then he'd go away for a couple of hours. So the manager's looking around, and he's so he comes back and he asks the manager, "What did you see?" And he said, "Well, I saw this and I saw this and this." And then he says, "Look again." And he goes off for another couple of hours. So it's forcing people to get into the discipline of observing in detail what actually happens on the shop floor, not that superficial thing, let alone that managers are operating on the top floor, completely isolated from reality, based on the illusion of what they think happens. That happens so many times that people don't actually know what's happening on the shop floor. They're building a plan based on what they think is happening, not what's actually happening.
Right.
That's something that the Japanese, the Chinese as well, for that matter, are very good at. If you look at top management in Eastern organizations, is often an engineer who's running the company, and not somebody who's just done an MBA. So, people who really understand it. So you need that. You've got that in-depth knowledge of how things actually work. I always remember that, and his relentless focus in the lean world on what is actually happening. Observe it, because you get blind after a while, and certainly in the relation, as you mentioned, the relationships like the auditor-auditee relationship. You're not as sharp anymore. So you got to be replaced. It sounds a bit harsh, but the culture thing you talked on is very crucial. If you think about what's culture, a simple way of explaining what culture is that's the way we do things around here. That's the way we've done it for ages. This is how we do things. This is how we think. It's culture is often defined as a coherent set of behaviors, of artifacts, symbols that you see in organizations, habits that people have. And you got, having this discussion with quite a few people recently, many organizations have a corporate culture, corporate values that they like to everybody to adopt. But when you think about it, it's morally dubious whether you can impose values on individuals. That's the first thing. It might be morally dubious whether you should be doing it in the first place. The second thing is whether it's effective, because if you force everybody to think the same way, then you'll get groupthink, which is not very helpful. And if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, it comes back to this simple humanity. It's them and us. We like Bashir. We like our kind of people. Those strangers. We don't like those strangers, do we? No, we don't like those strangers. So we tend to stick to each other. But if we stick to each other for too long, then you'll get inbreeding and extinction. And that applies at a cognitive level as well. You're frozen, so you need to strengthen the gene pool with those strangers who we don't like. We've got to get them in as well. So you really do have to have diversity in values in your culture. You don't want too much diversity, because then you'll be constantly arguing with people and negotiating the differences. What I think, and I quite like the term, I forget who I stole it from, the term coherent diversity, that there's a degree of diversity, but it's enough to keep everybody on their toes, because I'm challenging you a bit, but not, we're not arguing every day about things, but we're keeping each other alert. So that topic of when you select people for your organization, to look at the kind of values that they have, not try and select people who are exactly as you are, but to get some diversity in it, and to encourage people, I think, on the topic of what people often refer to as psychological safety, where people feel comfortable expressing themselves without the fear for their reputation or their position. So they don't feel obliged to leave half of their values at the door when they come to work. They come on board as a complete person. So you get more of the whole character of somebody. So I think people are thinking much more often about that, because I think that is one of the keys to retaining staff, generating a rewarding and meaningful working environment.
There can be no more powerful example like this. There probably are, but in what I dealt with, I had a whole team in the room, and I deliberately, because of what I had heard, I put up some PowerPoint with things that were not correct in 2-3 places, right? Because they were really out of whack and made no sense. And yet nobody around the room spoke up, right? Because they were used to a culture where they had realized that if you speak up, you'll get fired or you'll get left behind for promotion. A lot of our corporations do work like that, sadly. And so what happened was, I remember calling each of these guys separately, especially the key guys, and saying, by the way, I don't recall hiring a yes person here. Okay. So you have a problem. Either you're a clerk or you're in this role. If you are in this role, start to act like one, because they would come to me for signatures saying, do you think I can do this? And I said, who's got the expertise? And I still remember one of the key guys would turn around and say, well, you come and ask me. I said, so you're asking me to go ahead when I'm going to come back to you to tell you, is this the right thing to do? Because when it comes to encryption or whatever, you are the guru on this. And he was taken aback. He said, but this is how it was. I said, it doesn't matter how it was. It doesn't. You have to understand one thing, that the only time you make mistakes is when you try to do things, right? If you don't do anything, you'll never make a mistake.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I'm going to judge you by how you cope with those mistakes rather than the other way around. So you start to do that. The only rule I have, if there's a screw up, you tell me first before I hear it from the press.
Yeah.
So that was the only thing. And what we had is a lot of interesting changes. Very good things started to happen. Do I see that happening widespread? No. Now, because of what we've just said, companies, literally shut down. We know that some airlines are going bankrupt. Some of them will not survive. There'll be a lot of aircrafts parked on the ground. Just as a thinking of the past, I see Boeing shares going up, and I'm asking myself how. When every aircraft is parked, or literally 96% are parked, even when they start, there'll be so many aircraft available, right? The 737 MAX orders have been cancelled. So I can understand the government stepping in to help them. But if you're trying to tell me that their shares is going up, I'm saying, hang on, what is that thinking that's causing this, right? And it's the same thing with whether you're a bank, your other organization, you're manufacturing, whatever you are, they will have to change if they're going to succeed in the new post-corona COVID-19 world, because there's no doubt. It's like I tell people that, unintended consequences. For example, now, if you can't go out, you order a takeaway.
Right? Yep,
and then deliver to your house, whatever. Same thing we're doing in grocery and whatever. And some people are forced to start delivery service that they never had. A lot of it will stay, because what will happen, people will discover places and businesses. They will also remember guys who actually were not kind to them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Like look at it on the credit card business. Where I came from, spent too much money in too much time in banking and airline and other industry. But then I'm looking at it and saying, the banks have turned around and said, okay, we'll give you 10.99% interest on the credit card, right? They've dropped it from 22%. I understand that. But if you're going to be helping people, how about turning on saying, if you are really qualifying for a loan at 2%, we'll give you a loan and pay off your credit card bill, right? A different thinking. So, but when you keep thinking about the shareholder value versus the people value, that's exactly what happens, right?
Yeah.
So it's not that I want to pick on a bank or a credit card issuer or anybody, but the point being, we're talking about the thinking here. So if they need to turn around and help, you have to take a step back and really turn around and say, what am I going to need in the new world in terms of technology? Like working from home, like we said, you need to be able, think about it, the old days. You give somebody a laptop or whatever, when they came into the company, a desktop, it's imaged. Even if you were giving them a laptop to work from home, it's imaged, so they can't change things or they can't download music. In tomorrow's world, that's not what's going to happen. they're already telling people to use their own systems because people
Yeah.
work.
Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how do you deal with that? That involves security, that involves access, that involves privacy. How many companies truly here, anyway, comply with GDPR? And I don't think many do. So it brings in a whole different thing, which brings us, we'll come back to this as we talked about a complex system and something to take a step back, technology being able to handle. But do you not think that ethics are going to play a very big role here?
Yeah, no, certainly. And you mentioned the Boeing 737 MAX tragedy, which happened a while ago, where software and software engineering seemed to play a pretty crucial role. That's the topic of ethics. You also mentioned that, so that emphasizes that technology affects lives. You also mentioned that our actions have unintended consequences,
Right.
you know, particularly when you're dealing with complex systems where you can't predict what's going to happen. And you know that each step will change the situation for the next step. So that's two of 5 points I'd like to make on the topic of ethics. The third one is that we were morally responsible for our actions, including the unintended consequences. Well, this means that organizations should be monitoring ethical behavior. And I think I mentioned his name, the guy behind the Cynefin framework that I mentioned, the sense-making framework, Dave Snowden, or maybe I didn't mention his name. But Dave I asked Dave to write a piece for the book that I wrote, that pink book,
Right.
on ethics. And he wrote a very, very good piece. And one of the nicest sentences in his 2,000 words was, just as organizations track their cash flow, they should also monitor the flow of virtue through the organization. I thought that's such a great phrase, monitoring the flow of virtue through the organization. In other words, are you taking the right decision? He came to the conclusion that that ethics belongs in the core of education of engineers, which I think is not the case at the moment, but it should have a more of a central position in the in education. But of course, ethics is not just about education; it's also about the values that people have, people's character, which part of which is genetically determined. You know, you're born with certain genes, and partially by your upbringing. What are the values that you have, and do they enable you? Do they help you to take the right decision? And you with ethics, you can. Some industries have ethical frameworks, principles that apply within their industry. But they don't tell you exactly what to do. They give you something to think about. With ethics, moral decisions, it's always about taking the least worse course of action, because you're deciding between two evils. So which is the lesser evil? I've had just a couple of comments. I've spoken about this topic at a couple of conferences. I've discovered that people are increasingly interested in this topic, thinking about what's the right kind of thing to do. And I think even just referring back to the culture discussion and values and creating an attractive workplace for people, I think that if you have a kind of an organization where people feel that they are able to do the right thing, that will also make you a better employer. But certainly, we should increasingly be thinking about what are the moral implications of our work.
You just talked about something just before we went live. We talked about the doing things right, which a lot of companies are doing the projects brilliantly. But what if that project should never have been done in the first place?
Yeah.
So it's doing things right, but more importantly, it's doing the right things. Right?
Yeah.
And you just laid out that. Now that also means what we just talked about is that the project management itself will have to change given this whole new environment, right? In how they operate also, right? What do you think?
Well, that's an interesting thing to bounce around. You could make the argument that when project management comes into play, the initial decision as to what to do has already been taken. Now, I like to view a fairly broad value chain where somewhere at the start, somebody has come up with an idea to do something. It's probably driven by market opportunity or an incident that happened in the business, but some seed of an idea. So you've got an idea. You next come up with a hypothesis. If we do this, then these will be the results. Is it plausible? Yeah, got a hypothesis. That's the time when you start thinking about, oh yeah, and what kind of requirements do we have? And then so that you can get it built. But that first stage really interests me. Because certainly if I think about the DevOps community, where the focus is mostly about how do we get software quickly into production, as quickly as possible without any disruptions. It's not as much about the speed of the actual development process, and it's certainly not about the speed of how long does it take for somebody to come up with an idea. Now, an interesting thought for people listening, for your good self as well. If you think, just as an example, the phenomenon of agile as a way of working. I often ask people who works in an organization that has an agile way of working. Some people stick their hand up. I say, do you recall when you adopted that way of working? They say, well, about 6 or 7 years ago. Then I remind them that agile has been around since the turn of the century, which means that they've possibly missed the first 10 years of the opportunity, because first, they weren't aware that agile was a condition that you could have. At the beginning, it was completely new. In the second stage, they'd heard about this agile thing, but no, surely that's not for us. That's for different kind of organizations. Another few years passed, and they discovered that their competitors were doing it. They started to take it more seriously. But in the case of many organizations, it has taken them 5, 10, maybe 15 years to come up with the idea, we are going to invest in agile. So what fascinates me is, although we're trying to get software shipped to production within a few hours, we are still taking years up front to come up with what kind of investment should we be making. If you're thinking about where's the weakest link in your chain, it might not be your development process. It might be where the whole thing starts, that you're not coming up with the right ideas, which ties back to doing the right thing instead of doing the thing right. So
I think it's fantastic what you touched on. So I'm going to use an example that we're dealing with right now and see what you think. And I'm talking about IT, but I'm going to use the COVID-19 situation just to compare it. The lowest paid workers in the hospitals, right, cleaners who come and sanitize the thing, don't get paid much. Nobody cared about them. You didn't even know who they were. Then you had nurses who, and NHS is a good example, but it's also in US and many other countries where they cut the funding to them drastically. So you had nurses, cleaners. Then you look at the garbage collector on our streets when you put out there, who take that away, your firemen, but also your grocery shops, the Walmarts of the world where you're getting your food and whatever. These are the lowest paid people. But guess what? Everybody's life is now dependent on those people.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so now bring it to technology. And do we not have the same situation where we may have bright people lower down, but we ignore, we don't listen to them, where they come up with ideas. We don't.
Yeah.
Right?
No, that's true. You just made me think about the Dutch Prime Minister, who was talking about the frontline people who are literally saving lives. But of course, mentioning the medical world and all the fire brigades and police and stuff like that. He also mentioned the IT industry. I thought, oh, hang on, because that's right. Because we are, look at all these people working at home. We are depending on IT to be able to buy stuff, to get it delivered, to communicate with each other, to reduce the social isolation that people feel. So suddenly, IT, not the fancy developers and architects, because we could miss them for a while, but the people in the proverbial basement keeping the lights on. They're the frontline workers who don't have the sexy reputation of some of the IT disciplines, but they're doing the job.
Yeah, absolutely. I can use one example just to back that up for a second, Mike. Mark, we were processing for the banks, right? All the banks, third party processing when I managed that business. What was happening is that we couldn't figure out why the billing was getting late. Some had picked up, some had not picked up. And I decided I'll go at night, 2 o'clock, just to see what the heck's going on. And these guys were watching, the hockey game late or doing whatever, having a coffee. Their job of this few guys was to load the tapes, because we get tapes from merchants, point of sale.
Sure.
And they would load it on things so that, Visa, MasterCard would pick it up. And I still remember when I realized what had happened, I went to them saying, by the way, you've been missing tapes in loading. He said, well, it's no big deal. I was supposed to do it at 2 o'clock, before 2 o'clock, but I managed to do it at 2:05. There's no big deal. And I realized that these guys don't understand that how critical the role is, because we have created that situation. Yeah. So I said, okay, order some beer and pizza and get the whole group in. And I said, let me tell you what happens. And when you load the tape, at certain time, Visa, MasterCard pick it up, right? So now there could be $20 million on the file. There could be 30 million, 50 million. It depends on what sales occurred that day by different merchants. Now, when you process and MasterCard, Visa pick it up, it goes to the banks. They owe this money to pay to the merchants, and they, of course, charge it to your credit card. What then happens is that you have also a billing cycle. So let's say it was my charge. I used it. But although I'd done it before my billing cycle, but this person was late in loading the tape. It doesn't get to MasterCard, doesn't get to the bank, it doesn't get to Visa, doesn't get to the bank. And it misses my billing cutoff, which means I'm going to get 30 days extra credit. Okay?
Yeah.
Very costly, because the merchant has to be paid up. They didn't realize that. I sit down with them, I put a chart up and I said, this is how it works. And they said, is this how it really works? I said, yes. Yeah. Now, they thought their job was lowly paid X number of dollars only loading tapes, when it was really a front-end function. If he didn't do his job properly, all the process down the line would be messed up. Yeah. And we haven't done a good job. We've got this triangle, right, that's working the wrong way. In the person at the top knows only this little part here. The lower you go down, they understand the whole thing, when in fact the triangle should be reversed, right?
Yeah.
That if you're only doing one job and you understand one, higher you go, right, the more you better know till you get. So this is what we need. And I think the hospital example, the medical professional and the supermarket is telling us that we need to take a look at the technology world and saying, are we actually getting the best out of our people, whoever they are and wherever they are? And would it be not a bad thing to have a town hall? Exactly what you suggested earlier is that you need teams working separate, saying, how would you solve this problem?
Yeah.
Right? And you might get a big surprise that it might not come from the guy you're paying $500,000. I can guarantee you. It's not going to come from that. It's going to come from a guy who you're paying the lowest, because he sees the problem every day. Right?
Yeah, and it ties in nicely with the topic of psychological safety, where the lower paid guy has to feel confident that he or she can contribute. It's sometimes used the situation of we're a medical team in an operating theatre,
right?
OR and we're doing an operation, you're the senior surgeon in charge, and you're also a professor,
Right.
and I'm the junior assistant, and I'm just looking. I think you're doing something wrong. Am I going to say something, or am I going to defer to your authority? So are you as the leader, are you creating an environment where the junior feels he or she can stick their hand up and say, "Are you sure, Professor?" So that's the kind of psychological safety that you want, because it's people on the ground who know what to do. And with complex systems where it's impossible to dictate, where you don't know up front what was going to happen, it comes down to these micro interactions between people and people and people and people and things. You can only, it's happening at the moment. And you have to give those people enough authority to, well, it's two things. You not only have to give them autonomy, but they have to exhibit agency as well. They have to you can throw down the gauntlet, but they have to pick it up. So it comes from two sides. So you want people who are prepared to take on that responsibility. I think one thing that motivates people a lot is the sense of purpose, giving them the context that you did with these people, telling, these are the consequences if you don't hit the 2 o'clock deadline.
Right.
Because then people realize, and this can be really inspiring, that these so-called lowly individuals really have the privilege of contributing to the well-being and prosperity of people at the end of the value stream. And that gives you a sense of purpose. And human beings, we are meaning-seeking people. Meaning-seeking beings. We want a sense of purpose, and that is something that really appeals to people. And I think that's the managerial role, to not only to take away the impediments, but to give the people on the floor the context so they know which decisions are best.
There's another part that involves technology, is compliance. When we had significant fraud problems that we were experiencing at Visa a long time ago at the point of sale, when we had magnetic stripe and all that, I realized that we were going to be taken to cleaners. They were seeing a lot of problems out there. So there was myself and another person. We started AIS ESS, so Account Information Security, Data Security Standards. Now, the purpose of that standard was because we couldn't tell the company, we couldn't go in and tell them, by the way, your enterprise is not secure, or you're doing something which is not protecting the business, because they would tell us to take a hike. But we could tell them how to handle our credit and debit cards, right? So we put a standard together, which is now known as PCI DSS. So why did we put that standard together? What was the purpose? We were getting our butt kicked with the fraud problems. Was to don't take data you don't need to. If you take it, you better protect it. You better ensure who has access to it, why they need access to it. And there was a whole thing. But what was the bottom line intent? Was to prevent this data breaches, prevent fraud problems, and basically lower the cost, because fraud, every dollar of fraud that you write off on the books actually costs you $10. They don't see hidden in the budgets. So technology has a very interesting thing that they don't realize truly where it's costing them, even when they have inefficient systems, because the cost is spread all over. And customer service may be getting 100 calls for that particular problem, but it's a customer service budget. We don't do zero-based budgeting, right? We do budget last year's numbers plus or minus certain numbers. So the problem never got identified, and we normalize incompetency, right? Basically, that's what we did. Now, the reason I bring it up is I'm saying that we need to, exactly as what you summed up there also, is that we need to turn around and tell people why we do it, not the what to do. Today, they know what to do, right? And when the why changes, they don't know how to deal with it. Today, if you look at the world, everybody wants that piece of paper to say they're PCI compliant, which means they take shortcuts. They will say, I want a scope reduction. But you would need PCI if you had enterprise risk management and security in place. Look at the different Sarbanes-Oxley, PCI compliance, 27001, PIPEDA, you look at GDPR, many of the standards that are there. Each of them done is separately by corporate board. Each of them, they got expertise. The truth is that 70 to 80% of requirements are common criteria, the common sense stuff and the part. Yet we do it separately. How about if we brought those things together? I mean, the compliance standards will still be separate because they're done for different reasons. SOX was done for truth in financial reporting and so forth, and this is done to protect data. But if we were to do that so that you have an overriding authority in that organization responsible for that, and you have individuals or people responsible for those different compliance, you don't go to your auditors in Big Four and five and start doing it several times. You do the one to knock off the 70, 80% of the criteria. Now you deal with residual. And you have systems in place where anything changes in any part of your software, systems that you launch, new applications, new updates, new patches, it will tell you, by the way, it's going to impact this, right? So you correct it almost in real time, that you go and say, hang on, before you go live, let's fix this. So you do testing. Not there was an example of testing that was done for a telco a couple of years ago, and they were brought down here. So what had happened? When you use your mobile, it takes you to a cell tower, connects you to the cell tower, opens the session. When you get past it, it now hooks you up to the second different cell tower because you're physically now in that location, and shuts down the previous one. Well, guess whatever testing they did, it was not done properly, and it kept opening the session, but it wouldn't close it. So the network was brought down. People were out of for a while, and then they realized this. Now, what was the problem? It's not. I always look at it and saying, don't blame people. Look at actually the process and how you did it. And it could be very well that somebody who actually said this is wrong, but if I open my mouth and go to the other guys at the top, they'll fire me. And the result was a very costly exercise. We see that happening all the time, where it's not that things don't necessarily go down because somebody picked it up quickly and corrected it, or it went down, you don't hear about it. And I think I've seen that. We've done more paperwork. Technology is fantastic, but you need to make sure, like you said, and we both agree completely on that, you better understand what your needs are first. Then you go down, and in today's world, you need to revisit that, saying, all right, in the new world, which is just around the corner, it's already started, how are we going to deliver value to my clients, right? To the businesses, and I'm the business, how will I protect this? In order to protect that, what's I better understand what the people need right now, right?
Yeah.
And then you only say shareholder value is all very nice, but if we don't include the people value and the conduct risk, which is the culture, and all the things we talk about, ethics, ACM wrote a fantastic code of ethics, which we've adopted at BIZTEK, because we don't want to start reinventing wheels. They have done a fantastic amount of work, because I give the example of Volkswagen and Audi emission testing, and I'm saying, are you trying to tell me nobody who programmed that, they were not aware that this was wrong? Yeah. Obviously they were. People knew about it, but nobody blew the whistle. The whistle was blown from somewhere outside, from a third party, right?
Yeah.
So it is a very interesting thing. But if you were to sum up what we are saying, right, and we'll pick up as people come back and they want us to zero in on any individual thing, we can pick it up and perhaps do that.
Yeah, right? Sure. Yeah, it's just to capture this, and I made a note. It triggered what you just said triggered a link to a little white paper that Dr. Richard Cook wrote. He's a practicing anesthesiologist. So he's in the medical world, and his examples come from there, but he's universal guidance. The paper's called Why Complex Systems Fail, and I'll send you the link. Yeah. Short paper, but it really hits lots of these topics, lots of these points on the head, identifying the vulnerability of the kind of systems that we work with, and the fact that you can't predict what's going to happen, that your employees have to take educated gambles because they they have a gut feeling what's going to work, but they don't know for certain. So you have to give them the confidence and not blame them when what goes wrong, but explore the system. What went wrong in the system? It's not your fault. Something went wrong in the system. So that mentality. So I think that's good. Well, I think just sort of summing up, we explored the area of complexity, that it's very difficult to know exactly what to do. You have to act on the job. You have to give the people who have the knowledge, people on the work floor, have to give them not only the authority to take decisions, but also give them the context so that they know the why that you mentioned, so that they are guided in the kind of decisions that they should be taking. Yeah, no, it'd be interesting to see if this leads to any follow up. If anybody wants to follow up on what some of the topics, more than willing to continue the conversation either in another session like this or just offline, one-to-one.
I think, Mark, I will make sure that people are aware about the context, and as we get the feedback, we can do another session. This has been fantastic. That we didn't use any PowerPoint slides, but you got across some very, very important things, especially like, in the complex systems and how you would think about it. So before we part, if you can just give us one part for today, is that if you're a CEO right now, right, given the challenges we're talking about on the IT, what are the key things you would concentrate on if you're just a quick thing there?
Yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is trusting the people who actually know what they're doing. So going down, it's possibly a little bit biased by the good thoughts that happen in the lean industry when people they say go the Gemba, go to the production floor, see what's actually happening, observe what's happening there, trust the people who are doing the job. Is that switch to what people refer to as servant leadership, where you're trying to enable your workforce. You're employing knowledge workers, you're employing intelligent people. Treat them seriously. I think trust is, and possibly it's on the same theme really, but recognizing the humanity of what we do in technology. Although we talk about software engineering, much of software engineering is really social engineering. It's about those intimate little interactions between people. I think recognizing the humanity of it all. I think that's my parting shot.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What I will do is, as we get the feedback, Mark, first of all, thank you for doing this. We really, truly appreciate that. It's
Pleasure.
Been very thoughtful, insightful, and I think now makes us hopefully take a few steps back to think about. There's some pretty powerful insights into what you talked about. And we will definitely be bringing you back to help us here, especially because the type of stuff we've loaded here are pretty heavy, and we've touched the surface, right? So
yeah, but at your service, what I'll also do is just a quick thing. I wrote that book last year. Right. This year I wrote a book about the book.
Oh, okay.
Reflections on, and I self-published it on Amazon, which was great fun. So wrote a book about the book. I've written an article on LinkedIn about the book. What I'm doing on the LinkedIn article is I'm giving free excerpts of the content in my book, sharing on a weekly basis. I'm putting little bits and pieces in. I think some of the contributions might reflect on what we talked about. So that might be a source for people to take a look at the kind of content that I'm currently thinking about for what it's worth. But I say the final message to anybody listening is don't take this all too seriously. This is just my nonsense. Take yourself seriously and decide for yourself what's important to you.
Yeah.
It's your problem. It's not my problem. It's your problem. I'm at your service if you need me.
Thank you very much, Mark Smalley, for doing this today for us from Amsterdam. We had a very interesting chat, and you covered some excellent ground with some very good themes. And while we try to park it high level, we'll drill down on any of the different things we talked about in different sessions, because otherwise we can't do justice to it. So big thanks. Now recap some of the things we talked about today, and again also share with you who BIZTEK is. So as I just talked about the fact that we are BIZTEK Professional Association of Canada, BIZTEK, part of ICCP, where we also provide certification, education, training, mentoring, and there's a lot more details, so I won't go into it here, but the bottom left of your screen, there is a YouTube video we've created, and the link is right here. If you can click on it when you get a chance, you'll get a lot of details about what BIZTEK is about, how you can join them, how you can attend webinars, and how you can join us in not just as a member, but volunteer and get involved, because that's what it's all about. We are an organization of volunteers, and we're there to help you. So that'd be fabulous. Now, very quickly, Mark did an excellent job today of talking about where we're going. And so I'll just recap very quickly some of the things we talked about, and hopefully you'll give us some feedback for what are the areas you want us to drill down on. And I think Mark's discussion, or the discussion we had today, is very relevant for a few reasons. Number one, we are in the middle of pandemic, coronavirus pandemic. 81% of the world's workforce, either it's unemployed completely or partially, and they're working from home. That's 81%, or 2.7 billion globally, I'm talking about. If you look at even from the airline industry, 96% of the aircraft are parked. And none of these things are going to suddenly come back. Even if they start the opening up the business and all that, nobody's going to run suddenly to the shops to buy things, because there is a new normal and people got used to it, and there's unintended consequences. So we need to think about it. Now, we were talking about systems, so let's talk briefly about that and leave that concept on the table for what we're talking about. We covered the system complexities and how organizations need to think differently. It's not going to go back to the old ways. I know some people might think it is. It's not going to happen that way. A lot of changes will happen. Some of us have seen certain ups and downs. Some are very new to this because they came out of universities in the workforce a couple of years, whatever. May not have seen, but need to be ready. We are addressing not just that group, but we're talking even to the leaders, CIOs, IT, right at the top, because they'll have to drive. Leadership is now going to be critical. It'll require different change, because the way we are understanding now, many companies will not survive. Many businesses will not survive. Your cruise, you've got serious problems. Your airlines, depending on how you are capitalized and what role you are playing, you will struggle, but you'll be back. But smaller airlines, which are hand to mouth, may not survive. So we need to think differently. That means our systems have to change or operate differently. People are going to work from home. More people will work from home. Universities and colleges, we already know, are pushing very hard to do online. So there are many different things at play here, and we need to make sure we understand where it's going. You can never predict 100%, but we are smart people, so we can all turn around and think about where we think it's going, but understand who the people are. So that's one part. Ethics and virtues need to be not only there, we know there's been in short supply. I mean, I'm not telling you any tales out of school. There has been in short supply. We need to make sure we get back to those basics and make sure it flows through the entire organization, not in one place or the other, so that we can actually benefit from this. So that's what we talked about. Third part, we talked about organizational culture. This is very important. You hear about conduct risk. That's what we're talking about. If you don't manage this properly, and the culture of the organization, or conduct risk, as you could call it, is not addressed, and the tone at the top becomes very important. Don't do as I say, do as I do. It's what important, very important to lead from. And we know that there's a shortage of leadership even in the world today. That doesn't help, but we need to make sure that we do that. The fourth part, because the people are going to be working from home, so a lot of things will have to change, is the fact that organizations need to understand what are their needs. We know we have not just outsourced some of the things to the outside world, where we send certain processing, customer service, whatever. But we also, in many cases, outsource our needs to other people, where a vendor tells you. So you need to take a step back, now understand yourself as to what your needs are before you go down in one direction or the other. You may have to hedge certain things because there is no crystal ball here, because it's not the type of situation we've been in before. But it will require good thinking. But to do that, you need to make sure you get all your people involved, right from the bottom to the top, or you will make the mistakes we've seen in the past. This is going to be very, very important for success. We are here to partner with you. We want to share. We're not here to knock anybody. We're just talking about the lay of the land that we are now. It's, as they say in life, you can only deal with the cards you've been dealt. So these are the cards we have now been dealt. How are we going to deal with it? This will decide whether you're successful just hanging in there, or you can't stay in business too long. So that's the important thing, which means continuous education, understanding, using experiences of the past to the extent that they address the principles are going to be very important. BIZTEK is here to help you. We are doing webinars, as you have seen quite a few in the last few days. We provide training. There's a certification program, as you can go to www.iccp.org, and you will see all the certification programs we're doing. And we'll bring very soon a site here before too long so that you will be able to do that. We will continue doing this. But one last appeal to each of you, please volunteer, get involved. This organization is not for us, it's for you. And we only put it together because of the fact that a lot of people had been calling me and my colleagues after what we had done in the past, and when we kind of left that they wanted, there's a need for that. And there's not a need for a siloed environment where we do one part. We are talking about bringing business technology together and look at it differently, because that's where what we'll have to do to succeed. So I thank you for your time today. Please reach out to us. We are here to help you. We are all volunteers. And you see us presenting, talking about it. It is to talk with you, not down to anybody. We also need to make sure we are upfront, honest, and we are very happy to do that. So please get involved, and we will make sure that we can together make a big difference to the organizations, to the employees, the province, and the country. Thank you very much once again for your time today, and stay tuned. If you join BIZTEK, there's no fees at the moment. You can join. We'll keep you informed of all the webinars, activities, and it'll be a pleasure. All the very best. Thank you, and stay safe.